We are back once again with Erika Brown, the publisher and editor of The Cricket, coming to us from her beautiful office in downtown historic Manchester by the Sea. How you doing, Erika?
I'm doing great, Kory. How are you?
Well, how are you? We've had a had a big week over in your neck of the woods.
We definitely have. I mean, it was a big week. We talked a little bit about it last week. We said that town meetings were coming, and they were two town meetings on the same night. So they were basically like dueling town meetings.
Yeah.
Essex and Manchester had their town meeting the same night. It was a little hectic from my perspective because, we cover both of them.
Mm.
But I have to tell you, one couldn't have been more different from the other. So I'll start with the less dramatic one. How's that? We'll start with
Let's
Essex.
do that. Yeah, yeah.
All right, so Essex, and by the way, for the record,
Our
it's
friends
not
to the west, we call it. Yeah.
so it's not at all, and people who know, it's not at all that Essex isn't prone to drama at a town meeting. It's just that this one had no drama.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's not, cast them into it. But it was very smooth as silk. It was kind of really easy. Put it this way, they went through 20 articles in an hour and a half.
Oh,
They
wow.
started at
That's
six.
impressive.
Yeah, they started at 7, they were out by 6:30. So that tells you everything, doesn't it? They had 20 articles, all but one passed, and the one that didn't pass failed narrowly, and it wasn't. I mean, I'm not going to say it wasn't a big deal but it was not the center of attention.
Mm.
The articles that were the center of attention all passed, and they passed pretty easily, and they were interesting. So one is like the first, it was like 2, 3, and 4, right? All had to do with the transfer station. Now, for those who, I mean, are you familiar with the role of the transfer station in the town of Essex, Kory?
Probably not now that you just put it that way.
It, when you say the transfer, it's kind of a loaded thing because the transfer station is one of those really important parts of Essex because Essex does not have curbside pickup. You
Hmm.
don't put your trash out on the road every week. You actually bring it to the transfer station, or it used to be known as the dump. And the dump was the great equalizer, right? Everyone was forced to go to the dump unless, of course, you have private service, which some people do, but not a lot. But anyway, so the transfer station is important. That's the point. So there were 3 articles that went through, and one of them, I'll start with like kind of the middle. They approved 280,000, I think it was, to improve the transfer station with maintenance and repairs, and then they also passed, and this represented a little bit of a huge bump in terms of an increase, but it was an increase in the cost of having their trash vendor. And that actually led to the third one, which was actually article number 2. So they passed like $150,000 for the trash vendor. So that's what they passed, right?
Hmm.
But really what it was about was the first article about the transfer station, which was about the stickers. Now, the stickers to get into the dump are a fee. They're usually annualized, and the last annual sticker expired in August 31st, and they went to a 6-month system. They went from 1 year to 6 months.
Yeah.
So that you have a sticker now, if you live in Essex, that went from September 1st through February. So they had to vote in the new sticker system. Well, it turns out that it's now going to be $250, which is quite a big jump because costs are going up across the board. But I think it's $250 for a 6-month sticker. Starting February through June, and then they have a half price for seniors, so it's like 125. Well, what they're going to do is they're bumping it into these 6-month increments because they need to kind of figure out what they're going to do now. I have a feeling Essex may become one of those towns that has curbside pickup. It may not. It may be like Manchester that has a combination. We have a transfer station and a pickup, curbside pickup.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to figure that out, and that's going to be figured out probably by next year. So that was one thing. And then the other thing they did, which was kind of a big deal, is they approved 1.150 million, so $1,150,000 to purchase an 11-acre parcel of land on Apple Street.
Hmm.
Now, Apple Street is a really beautiful street. It's kind of a windy road. It's getting a lot of attention because it is sort of a backup access road when the Main Street bridge is down or flooded. So, and they're actually going to be raising a part of Apple Street, 800-foot area, part of it, which is on one end where there aren't really houses. And so attention's on Apple Street, right? And the transfer station is on Apple Street. So this land, which is 11 acres, abuts the transfer station. It was actually put under agreement, but because of a tax designation, the town had the right of first refusal. It can buy it. And it had 120 days from like September to make its move. And it did, and it did it at what I thought was interesting. It did it quickly and without a lot of fuss. It passed easily and pretty easily. So there you go. Essex owns 11 acres, which it can use for anything from, there's a culvert to get into the transfer station, which people think is pretty vulnerable. So this could be an alternative access. It could also be, by the way, they could have it in their hip pocket in case a 40B proposal comes in from a developer. They could have this land in their hip pocket to say, I think we're going to do our own development for our own housing, something like that. Or they could just have it for open space or recreation, something like that. So anything, they can do anything with it, but it gives them options to play. So there you go. That was Essex, and it was easy. So
and now results from WrestleMania.
Okay, WrestleMania. Oh my God, I'm going to use that next year, honey. Anyway, so at Manchester couldn't have been more different, and here's why. And it was one of those perfect storm situations. First of all, a lot of people showed up. Remember, we were talking about the mailers that went out, the Manchester Matters mailers. And so there were a lot of people sort of amped up about the topic. There were, I think 17 or 16 articles. The meeting started at 6:30. It opened at 6:30 supposedly, or we were supposed to start at 6:30. It didn't get started until almost an hour later. So compare that to Essex. And then it got out at 10 o'clock, and it was sort of abruptly stopped by just passing over the rest of the articles out of mercy. And that was at 10 o'clock, and they didn't even get past, like they got to the 9th article. They got through 8 articles. So there you go. All right. So what happened in Manchester was there were a lot of people who showed up. Now there were 2 rooms that you could go into in the Manchester Essex Middle High School, and you could either go into the auditorium or the cafeteria. And people think that's because there were so many people, 550 people showed up to vote, right? But that's not it at all. It was already supposed to be in 2 rooms because the moderator and the Board of Health had decided that if you were going to be in the main arena, World Wrestling, you had to have a mask on the whole time. You had to be masked. So they offered up the cafeteria as sort of a alternative, right? Well, they needed that alternative because a lot of people showed up. Then they had technology issues. Do you remember earlier this year with the technology issues of the voting tabulation?
Click. I remember that. Yep.
Exactly right. Well, I'll tell you one thing. This was not in my article this week, but they did a test in the beginning, and they tested just the cafeteria in front of everybody with the projections, of what happened. And they said only people in the cafeteria should vote. Who should, and they asked some system, vote, please, 1, 2, or 3. And it came back 0. 0 tabulated votes from the cafeteria. It was quite a moment, actually. And it set the tone for sort of this underlying kind of anxiety or chaotic feeling to it. So what they did was, thank God, the moderator had these backup things that he did put in place the last town meeting because of this exact problem where 2 rooms aren't talking to each other with the computers, right? So we now had this system that was projecting what the votes were. And as a result, he was able to get through the meeting by a combination of hand reconciling those votes, doing them in different waves, doing it electronically, or doing a hand count, an old-fashioned hand count. So in the end, it ended up fine, but it wasn't ideal, and it lent itself to this feeling that was a little blah, 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 So what happened? What happened was all of the votes, I think, all of the articles that were considered got passed. So it actually ended up totally fine. If you look at the action from the meeting, not the feeling in the meeting, but the results, it actually was very straightforward and pretty smooth. So here's what happened. They voted through some money things. They voted $420,000 for a new ambulance to replace a 12-year-old ambulance with the fire department, which thank God they did, because the price has gone up 20% since the last time they considered this last year. Oh, wow. So there was some urgency there. And also remember, the fire department in Manchester makes money from its ambulance services. People sit there and say, oh, why do we want to spend money on the fire department? Well, guess what? It's a revenue center for the town. So Ambulance services is good business. So anyway, so there you go. That they also voted in $130,000 for the legal services to defend the town's denial of the SLV 40B development. So if you followed that, it's now in Boston, and now $130,000, and that's just the initial payment actually for the legal defense. So that went through. And then then became the articles, and there were two categories. The first one was a citizen's petition by a guy named Ron Skates. He lives over in Boardman Avenue, over by Harbor Street, on the water there. And he brought up a citizen's petition to recall elected officials. And he said, he came out and said, we knew this was coming because there's a group of people who got very upset that the Board of Selectmen last March or April had an election, a non-binding referendum about regional dispatch. Most people said they wanted to keep it local. And then a month and a half later, the selectmen went against that and went regional, right? So they were upset, and they wanted to say, we didn't like your vote. We want to put in a measure that can yank people out if they don't do what we would want them to do, right? So the level was like 50 signatures to get it started. So you really had kind of a situation where theoretically 1,500 people could vote in somebody, but something like 500 or 600 could vote them out.
Yeah, right.
That doesn't sound very democratic. But there are other towns that do have recalls. Recalls are not unusual, really. They're not unheard of. And as a matter of fact, there's one going on in Wenham right now. Wenham has a recall vote. And apparently there was a board member, I'm not going to say what board they were on, but there was some impropriety. They asked him to leave. He refused. And now they have a recourse, right? So Eli Bowling, who used to be the chairman of the select board during COVID and during the friendly 40B negotiations with SLV, he got up and he was really compelling. And he said, listen, a recall provision is fine, but recalls should be very hard. They should be, and this was his quote, they should be a resource, not a weapon. And he said, oftentimes elected volunteer officials do things that are A, unpopular, and B, they can't be avoided. They're being forced to do it. And people don't understand that. Like, people thought that the town was being friendly to the 40B because it was going through the state mandated friendly 40B process, right? So he was saying people who just didn't understand that, they could have voted us out. COVID, for instance, there were a lot of people who didn't like the shutdowns early on. They were mandated and they were supposed to, but what if you had a recall that could say, I don't like the fact that you're making me wear a mask in a restaurant? Well, it's an emergency. So things like that. So here's what happened. It passed, but it passed as an amendment, and as an amended article, where they raised it to 200 signatures required to get the process started. So now it's going to go to the state legislature. By the way, fun fact, Eli also brought up that back in 2005, the town voted in what? A recall amendment, a recall provision. And it was supposed to go to the state legislature, and then for whatever reason, the state legislature never acted on it.
Faded, huh? Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
I'm going to call Bruce Tarr. I'm going to say, hey, Bruce Tarr, what happened with that? Anyway, so that happened. Then we got into the drama, the real drama. The real drama was around the planning board articles. Now, the first thing that kind of set the tone is the planning board itself has been working on recodification for 3 years. They've had 100 meetings in 3 years. They're public forums, like all sorts. They bent over backwards to share everything. Everything's on the website, all the redlined, bylaw. They hired an outside consultant who's like the #1 guy at land use in the state. And it's all he does is recodification. So it wasn't controversial what they were doing, but all these people showed up because they were misinformed, and they were saying, well, we don't know anything about this. What's been going on? We want to see the red line version. And you're like, well, the red line version's on the website. It has been for a long time. In any case, that brought up, and there were 2 planning board members, Christine Delisio and Mary Foley, who voted against bringing those articles to town meeting. But they were outvoted 4 to 2, right? 4 to 2. So usually what happens is people say, okay, well, this is the vote of the board. This is the will of the board, and I'm going to get behind my board now, right? Not in this case. They lobbied to actually make a statement at town meeting against their own board that was bringing these articles to town meeting. It was a little confusing. Mm-hmm. The moderator, Alan Wilson, he let one of them speak as a rebuttal right after the chairman formally introduced the articles to the floor. Now, typically what happens is if somebody on the board doesn't agree with what their board did, it's perfectly fine to express that. Like Ann Harrison is on the select board. She actually spoke up about not agreeing with her board when they didn't go with the recall provision, right? I mean, not the recall provision, the regionalization vote. And she said that, but she said it during public comment. She didn't say it at the beginning when you're formally, the person, like Ron Skates gets up and is given 2.5 minutes to present his citizens article, right? Mm-hmm. Ron Mastrogiacomo, the chairman of the planning board, gets up and presents his articles. Well, then we get another member of the planning board standing up and giving essentially a rebuttal for 2.5 minutes on the same platform. Mm. And Alan Wilson said, what caught my attention is when he said, now, Ms. Delisio is going to speak, and we're not setting a precedent. He actually said that. We're not setting a precedent. Think about that. It means he knows it's a valuable thing that somebody else is going to want to do, and he's getting ahead of it saying, we're not going to do this anymore. So it begs the question, why the exception? But whatever. So those articles went through. The first ones, there were people who stood up. The head of Manchester Matters, Sheila Pigeon Hill, she got up and spoke after her apology for the illegal use of the town seal. But she, people spoke out against the planning board stuff. But guess what? One by one, those things started to pass. Even Mary Foley tried to get up and split one of the articles because she's very much believes that the planning board should be overseeing curb cuts. Now, curb cuts really, in every town in the state, I think Manchester might be the only town in the Commonwealth where the planning board has to approve a curb cut for a residence. Oh. Yeah, it's usually in the domain of engineers, like the DPW. Yep. It's in the general bylaw, not the zoning bylaw. But anyway, because the domain of the DPW. So she got up and she said, well, these other things belong with the DPW, but not curb cuts. And because it's a way of controlling building, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a way of controlling density. So anyway, so she got voted down by 2 votes, and then they passed the article anyway. So it all went through fine. And then in the end, at about 10 o'clock, the planning board passed over the rest of the articles. They're probably going to revisit them later, I would imagine. Those are the real tough ones. They have to do with ADUs, accessory dwelling units, all those other things. In the end, everyone left super exhausted, I'm sure. I'm sure that, guess who was exhausted? Everybody on that stage was exhausted. I bet. Alan Wilson was exhausted. Diane Bucco, the town clerk, was exhausted. Tiffany Marletta was exhausted. They were all exhausted. And I'm sure they're now going to really finally take a look at their computer system for the tabulation and the capturing of those votes. Yeah. The electronic system.
Something's going on there. So do we have any idea when this continuation occurs of?
My guess is the next opportunity is in the spring, for the annual town meeting. And I would imagine they're going to do it, but who knows?
Gotcha. Well, great stuff there, Erika. There was a lot to unpack.
I know, I'm sorry. That was a long...
Hey, that was worthwhile. That was pretty thorough. We needed that. Now, on the lighter side, what's going on with the field hockey team?
Oh my God, the field hockey team, and this happened the night before, like way after deadline. I basically got it the morning of that we were going to press, but we put it on the front page because it was so great. And I'm going to read this actually because it came from Paul Clark, our assistant editor, actually wrote this up. The Manchester Essex Hornets girls varsity field hockey team had a very dramatic win that got them into the state finals. Or the states, got them into states. I don't think it's the finals yet. It's just the states. Yep. But anyway, what happened is they went down to Watertown on last Tuesday, and they played Cohasset. And I guess they were down, and I'm going to read this. They were down 1-0 with 8 seconds to play when a combination of passing from Kaylee Patrick and Abby Kent led to a goal by Grace Gerhardt to the game, and that made it 1-1. Then Grace Gerhardt scored the only goal in the ME's Elite 8 win against Lundberg, and that sent them to the Final Four. And after no scoring by either team during double overtime, the game was sent into a shootout where Kaylee Patrick beat the Cohasset goalie to send the Hornets to the state finals with a 2-1 win.
Wow.
Isn't that awesome?
Yeah. There's a lot of drama going on in Manchester.
I know. Well, listen, that's the Manchester Essex.
Yeah, that's true.
There could have been some great people from Essex on there. So yes, so the district, I mean, I just loved reading that, because could I have like replicated that? That's like amazing.
Yeah. Well, congrats to that's awesome stuff. Yeah, good luck in the finals.
I know. I love it.
Eric, before we go, you want to mention the turkey trot's coming up.
Oh yeah, you know what? If I had to mention one event, it's one of my favorite events of the year. The Essex Lions, forgive me if anybody else is in on that, because I just think of this as a Lions event. But it's the Turkey Trot, which is it's the 44th annual Turkey Trot. It starts off at Woodman's in Essex. It's every morning. It's like starts off at like 8 a.m. It's actually 9 to 10:30 is registration. And it's Sunday, the 20th of November at 11 a.m. is really the full thing, with the registration in the morning. Sorry, I think I just confused people. 11 a.m. Sunday. And it's like a 5K walk, run, race. It's like everyone's involved. That's what I love about it. And people get dressed up, and the weather's usually, perfect for it, I hope. I hope. And it's just a lovely event. I love those guys.
Yep, that's one of the good ones. So hopefully we'll be there for that too. Okay, Erika, that was great. Thanks for your time. We will see you this time next week.
Bye, Kory.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.